All right, ladies and gentlemen, so hopefully you can hear me well. We're going to finish up today with Notes D, which will be a part of your Unit 3 Part 1 test. And Unit 3 is all about the second term of the Washington administration, and then the John Adams administration. So we're really looking at years about 1792 to 1800. And at the beginning of his second term, Washington had a really tough decision to make. He looked overseas and he realized that the conflict between the French and the British was soon going to have to be something that America would deal with. Obviously, there are strong, close ties to each side. For the French were our allies in the Revolutionary War. They helped us win our independence, even celebrated by giving us the Statue of Liberty. And so it was natural for a lot of Americans to feel like the French were our allies. However, because of the violence and the brutality of the French Revolution, some people really felt like the French Republic had gotten too far out of hand, that that it was too out of control. And so, even though the Democratic Republicans really supported the French as liberty-loving people, the Federalists on the other side, with Hamilton, really viewed the British as a much more stable form of government, stable form of economic means in terms of creating the bank, and so the Federalists, meaning they aligned themselves with the British when it came towards this conflict between these two superpowers. And in a lot of ways, Washington was kind of stuck in the middle. Washington fought alongside the French with men like Marquis de Lafayette, and yet he also was Federalist in nature and really admired young Hamilton. And so, rather than choosing the French or the British, what Washington decides to do, it's a really smart policy, is he decides to be neutral. And if you read this quote here, you might start to understand what he has to say here. So let's quick look at this. Quote says, "If we are permitted to improve without interruption the great advantages which nature and circumstances have placed within our reach, many years will not revolve before we may be ranked not only among the most respectable, but among the happiest people on earth." So what Washington's saying here, if you take time to translate that, is America has so many advantages from its physical standpoint, from its circumstantial standpoint, that it's far away from Europe, that we need to stay out of as many problems as we are. And we would call this isolationism. That's a vocab term that we're going to start dealing with. But Washington called it neutrality. But this idea that because we are so far away, we shouldn't be involving ourselves in European problems and European powers. And so Washington basically says, look, we're not going to favor either side. We're going to continue our relationship with each one. And while Jefferson doesn't love that, and the Democratic Republicans don't really love that outcome, they do respect it. And Jefferson respects the intent of that policy of isolationism and how it will allow America to grow without all these interruptions and disadvantages. So that's no problem. And so they understand Washington, they respect him. However, the only side that did not respect the neutrality were the British. And since the British had a strong navy and they controlled the waters, they kept American ships from reaching the French. So while we, meaning America, would want to try to trade with both sides because that was advantageous, the British wanted to keep supplies from getting to their enemy. And so with these attacks, we decided to try and negotiate. And so we send our Chief Justice, John Jay, the head of the Supreme Court, over to Britain to try to negotiate them. He represented the highest form and position of our law interpreting body. And so we send John Jay over to meet with them. And John Jay meets with them, he talks with them, and he creates a treaty. And you see the treaty on the left over here. It's called Jay's Treaty because he's the one that wrote it. And here are the terms. Basically, the United States said, hey, we want you out of the western forts in America, and we want you to stop attacking our ships. No problem. That sounds pretty self-explanatory. Now, what the British wanted, however, was that the U.S. would pay back all of their debts. If you remember from our Articles of Confederation simulation, we talked about how we still owe Britain a sizable amount of money. So they stop attacking our ships. We pay back our debts. No problem. John Jay writes him a check. He gives it to Britain. He comes back to America and says, hey, Great Britain is not going to attack our ships because I just paid them all this money that came from your taxes. And a day goes by, I imagine a day or two, and John Jay turns around, and the British do not respect his deal. And they keep attacking the ships But now the U.S. has given them money, and John Jay and the Federalists look very, very bad. Okay, they anger everyone. The Democratic Republicans are angry because they thought that we had been establishing neutrality as our policy. They were not okay with working with the British. They felt like that was a stab in the back. The French also felt betrayed and start really fighting the United States as well because they now feel like we are sympathetic to the British. And even the Federalists don't really love this trade because their ships are still getting attacked, and many ship owners are going to be located up in the Northeast. And so this treaty is just a mess all over the board. And poor John Jay. John Jay gets a lot of flack for it. He claimed that the entire eastern seaboard was illuminated each night by protesters who would create these scarecrow-like images, call them effigies, and burn them in his... Or not effigies, I'm sorry. Scarecrows, but burning him all night. Alexander Hamilton tried to defend John Jay one day. He was struck in the head by a rock. And then my personal favorite is one day John Jay showed up to his house, and on a nearby building it said, "Damn John Jay. Damn everyone that won't damn John Jay. Damn everyone that won't put up the lights in the windows and sit up all night damning John Jay." So needless to say, he wasn't a very well-liked character, which is sad, which is unfortunate. He was just trying to do his job. And with that treaty, the Federalists are going to start to lose some of their momentum. Now, they don't completely lose momentum. And when Washington retires from politics in 1796, he gives his Federalist mantle to John Adams. Couldn't give it to Hamilton because Hamilton was an immigrant, but John Adams was a capable replacement. And it was a very close election in 1796. If you look here at this electoral map, I hope you start to notice some of the themes that the Democratic Republicans really took almost all the southern votes, plus some up here in Pennsylvania, and then the Federalists take all of the coastline almost and the Northeast, and you're starting to see some themes of where these people lie and where some of the patterns are. But it was a very close election, and Adams won. Now, if I go back a slide, Jefferson was okay with this. In fact, back in the day, the way that we would work is that whoever got first would win the presidency, and then whoever got second would win the vice presidency. Now, that obviously does not apply anymore, or what that would mean in today's terms, that in 2016, Donald Trump would be president, and Hillary Clinton would have been his vice president, if you can imagine the irony in that. So Jefferson becomes vice president. He's very okay with that. But Adams is the guy in charge, and Adams looks around him, and he now has this problem that because of John Jay's treaty, the French are angry at him. The French start attacking the United States, and it's a problem because the Democratic Republicans look at John Adams as an extension of Washington's Federalist Party and blame him for these problems. In fact, they start blaming him so much that the Adams administration came under a lot of heat, and Adams wasn't someone who was fond of criticism. He didn't do well with it, and in fact, there was so much resentment towards him that Adams decides to pass a series of laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And there are many parts to these laws, but there's two major components that you want to know. The first is the alien part. Aliens are persons who are not born in the United States, so we're not talking about people who are born in space somewhere. And sedition are actions or words that are meant to undermine the government. It's really sedition is when you speak badly about the government. So Adams creates these laws because he was getting criticized for his decisions and the things that he wanted to do. Now, the specifics, though, is that the sedition part of the act meant that if you were an American citizen and you said something negative or critical of your government, the federal government could come in and jail you or even fine you for saying those things. So it was really it was a law that was meant to discourage speaking out and voicing your displeasure. I hope some red flags are going up for you because this is exactly what you cannot do. This is a violation of the First Amendment right to freedom of speech. And yet, because we're in a young republic, we're still testing some of those waters. And so this law gets passed. It's very critical. The Alien Act part of the law increased the residency requirement from 5 to 14 years. Basically meant that he made it harder and harder to become an American citizen so that immigrants or people from other countries would not speak badly about the government as well. And folks, this is a direct violation. This is John Adams abusing the power of the presidency, which is exactly what Jefferson thought would happen and what he was worried about. And so these infamous sedition acts mandated fines and prison sentences for anyone who published bad things. Many of the Jeffersonian newspapers that were out and about in the southern states were getting indicted for sedition, and it was a problem. It was a major issue. If you'd like to go through these notes and read, there are 2 sedition cases. One who was the grandson of Ben Franklin, and another who was a congressman who was actually arrested and even beaten down in Congress for his acts of sedition. You can read some more about that. And all in all, 17 people were arrested and convicted, and 10 were convicted, fined, and imprisoned. So that number might seem small to you, but what you're starting to see here is the problem when we give the federal government too much power, when we allow them to institute implied powers which are not a part of the original idea of the Constitution. And these Alien and Sedition Acts look so bad across the country that it's eventually going to be the pitfall for John Adams. So the very acts that he creates to keep people from talking badly about him are going to be the same acts that eventually cost him his second term as the American president. And so during the Alien Sedition Acts, this is the final piece here, and this is very important. I hope you're still here. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison decide to really write a response to these sedition acts and how people should respond to it. You might remember, Jefferson and Madison are writers. Madison wrote the Constitution, Jefferson wrote the Declaration. And so both of these guys come up with these ideas of what happens when the federal government oversteps its bounds and does things that it's not supposed to do. Well, Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolution, and Madison wrote the Virginia Resolution. And basically it says this, okay? Jefferson and Madison came up with the idea of, first, of nullification. The idea that when states feel like the federal government creates a law that's not okay or unconstitutional, that they can choose not to enforce federal law, that they can nullify these things if they deem them to be unconstitutional. Now, in today's world, this is not okay, but this is the idea that he creates, that states shouldn't have to follow federal law if they feel like it's not okay. And the second idea that compounds that is the compact theory. And the compact theory was the idea that because states freely joined the Union, at any time they could freely leave. So you put these two things together, what you have is, if the federal government creates a law that they don't like the Alien and Sedition Acts, then first, they are allowed to nullify it. They can choose not to enforce it. And if the federal government decides that that's not okay, then the states have the right to freely leave the Union if they feel it's advantageous for them. So what we're setting up here are the exact reasons that the United States South, or the South, is going to leave during the Civil War. They are going to believe that the laws regarding slavery and tariff taxes and other things should be nullified. And if they cannot be nullified, if they feel like they lose in control, then they can freely leave at any time because of the compact theory. So many of the ideas that are later used by Civil War activists are actually going to be created early on by Madison and Jefferson. So important concepts that we're getting. You need to know nullification, compact theory for your test, and how those things are dealt. So I hope that's good. Please email me with any questions that you have, and be prepared for your test. Thanks.